Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So theories in cognitive neuroscience typically explain our cognitive capacities by positing internal representations, or at least so it seems, but there's no real consensus on how these internal representations function in theories. So what I want to do today is sketch what I call a deflationary account of mental representation, and then try to convince you that it handles the well-known problems better than the competitors. So here's the plan. I'm going to start with just getting some basic concepts on the table, and then I'm going to turn to the problem of mental meaning, which is kind of half of the problem of mental representation. I'm going to go really quickly through the main proposals, and I'm going to focus on what I think is the right view, what I call content pragmatism. Then I'm going to turn to an account of the vehicles of representation. So the question is, what is it for an internal state to function as a representation? And I'm going to conclude by showing that my account satisfies some plausible adequacy conditions on an account of mental representation. So that's the plan. So first of all, representations have two important features. They're physically realized, hence they're causally efficacious. So they actually play a role in mental processing. And they're also intentional. They have meaning or content. So one question is how something can have both of these properties, very different kinds of properties. So we can distinguish between representational vehicles on the one hand and representational content on the other. I'm going to propose a realist account of the vehicles and a pragmatic account of content. And I call the package a deflationary account of mental representation. Okay, so we can get a little bit more meat on this distinction between vehicles and contents by reference to two mappings. One is a realization, what I call a realization function, which specifies the vehicles of representation, and then secondly, what I call an interpretation function, which specifies their content. So I can make this a little bit more concrete by reference to an example. So here's a diagram, roughly, of some physical device that computes addition. Most generally, a physical system computes addition if there exists a mapping from physical states of the system to numbers such that physical states related causally can be mapped to numbers related as add-ins and sums. So here, this depicts a typical computational account of addition, of an adder. And what's interesting about this is that a computational model will specify two mappings, not just a single mapping from physical states to numbers, but rather two mappings. So the bottom takes you from physical state types to structures of some sort, maybe symbols, states. In this case, they're going to be numerals. And they're going to be identifiable as numerals. And the top mapping takes you from these structures or states, whatever you want to call these S's. They're really equivalence classes of physical states to numbers, to the interpretation. So let me say a little bit about how these arrows are to be interpreted. This is roughly the arrow of realization. Realization relation, hence the name realization function. The top vertical arrow is standing for the interpretation relation, and these the bottom two horizontal arrows are causal. So this middle one is causal at a higher level of abstraction, but both of those are causal arrows. The top is just the arguments and values of the function computed. So I'm going to be coming back to these ideas, realization function and interpretation function, as we go through the talk. Okay, so a theory of cognition appeals to representations just in case it posits states or structures realized in the brain. Those are going to be specified by the bottom mapping, the realization function, that have meaning or content, which is specified as by the interpretation function. So with these two notions of realization function and interpretation function in hand, we can go ahead and say what it is to appeal to representations. But that leaves two big questions. One is, how do mental representations get their meaning or content? This is the problem of intentionality. And the second big problem or big question is, what is it for an internal state to function as a representation? Or more specifically, maybe, what is it for an internal state to function as a representational vehicle? So I'm going to be looking at examining these two questions in turn. Okay. At the end, I'm going to want to come back and see how my account stands up against 4 adequacy conditions that Bill Ramsey identified in his 2007 book. I think these are reasonable constraints on the adequacy of an account of mental representation, though I'm going to end up questioning some aspects of the last constraint. So one is that mental representation must serve a function sufficiently like paradigm cases of representation. Shouldn't look completely different. Secondly, their content should be causally relevant to their role in cognitive processes. I'm not going to say anything really about these constraints now, but when I apply them to my own account, then I'll elaborate them a little bit more. Thirdly, the account should not imply pan-representationalism. So on the account, it shouldn't have the implication that lots of clear things that are clearly not representations end up being representations. And lastly, the account should neither under-explain representational capacities, that is, either presupposing understanding or leaving the interesting notion of understanding unexplained on the one hand, or over-explaining on the other. And the way that Bill cashes out over-explaining representations is just leaving what he calls mere causal relays. So if what you've got are mere causal relays, then it looks like you've kind of explained away the interesting notion. I'm going to come back to that point later. Okay, so then turning to the notion of the problem of mental meaning, there are 2 widely accepted constraints on an account of the meaning-determining relation. That is, the relation that's supposed to hold between the mental state or structure in the head and what it's about. One is that it should be naturalistic. So most players in this game accept that. What they typically mean is that the meaning relation should be specified in non-semantic or non-intentional terms. In other words, really, it should be reductive. And secondly, it must allow for the possibility that mental states can misrepresent. So what we're looking for here is representation in some robust sense that at least allows for the possibility of misrepresentation. Mental states don't represent simply in the way that tree rings represent the age of the tree. It's a more robust notion than that. Okay, so with respect to the naturalistic constraint, here's the motivation. The idea is that intentionality, whatever it is, it's not a fundamental element of the universe. It's got to be ultimately understandable in terms of something else. So here's Jerry Fodor motivating the idea. It's hard to see how one can be a realist about intentionality without also being, to some extent or other, a reductionist. If the semantic and the intentional are real properties of things, it must be in virtue of their identity with, or maybe supervenience on, properties that are themselves neither intentional nor semantic. If aboutness is real, it must be something else. And so then a naturalistic semantics would really specify what that something else is. Here's Hartree-Field, basically the same idea. There are no ultimately semantic facts or properties. That is, no semantic facts or properties over and above the facts and properties of physics, chemistry, biology, neurophysiology, and those parts of psychology, sociology, and anthropology that can be expressed independently of semantic concepts. So I want to sort of keep this motivation in the background as we're going through various proposals. What I'm going to do now is really briefly run through the most popular proposals for content, for mental meaning. this is going to be really fast. The point isn't to, I mean, what I really want to do is identify some problems that remain unsolved. I don't have any view on whether these problems ultimately can be solved naturalistically, but the important point really is that they haven't yet been solved, and theorists of cognitive neuroscience still attribute content undeterred. So what's the explanation for that? It seems to be fact seems to be crying out for explanation. So that's part of what I want to do here. So I think we could add to Bill's 4 adequacy conditions that an adequate account of mental representation should at least be consistent with the practice of attributing content in cognitive neuroscience. I'm going to skip this proposal because I want to focus on the two views that really bring out the contrast between naturalistic semantics and my proposal. So I want to focus on information theoretic semantics and teleological semantics. So information theoretic accounts, roughly they say that an internal state S means cat if and only if S is caused by the presence of cats. So Dretske, I think, was probably the first to explicitly propose something like this in his Knowledge in the Flow of Information book. And Fodor has a different account in his Theory of Content and other essays, Asymmetrical Dependency. The most commonly, there's a whole industry, there's been a whole critical industry in the last 25 or 30 years pointing out problems with these naturalistic proposals. So let me just kind of remind you of two of the issues that arise with respect to information theoretic semantics. One is the disjunction problem, the problem of error. So it's not just cats that typically cause this structure to be tokened in my head. It's also big rats on a dark night is going to make me think cat. So what's the content? Is it cat or is it cat or large rat on a dark night? Fodor, other information theoretic semanticists add bells and whistles to their account to try to deal with these various problems, and the proposals end up being pretty complicated. So another problem is that there's lots of things in the causal chain leading from the distal cat to the structure S being tokened in my head. Are they also part of the content? So it's not just the cat being out there that causes me to token this cat thought. It's also cat patterns on the retina. That's a proximal cause of what's going on in my head. So is that in the content? Is that the content? How do you decide? How do you choose? Okay, so those are just some problems, and maybe they're solvable, but it takes a lot of work to solve them. It obviously requires complicating up the account. Turning now to teleosemantics, the other kind of popular proposal. On this view, S means cat if and only S has the natural function of indicating cats. This is roughly Millikan's view. Later, Dretske, when he appeals to natural functions, David Papineau, Karen Neander, lots of other people. So the problem here, a whole set of problems actually, and this arises also for information theoretic semantics, but I think it's easier to see the issue coming up for teleosemantics. It are all kinds of indeterminacy issues. So teleosemanticists are notoriously unable to decide what the natural function of the frog's structure that's tokened when it lashes its tongue out at a fly. I think it's Millikan who originally proposed fly, and then she changed later to argue that it's some different content. Frog food, I think, was Kim Sterelny's proposal. Karen Neander proposes that the natural function of the tokening of the frog state is to indicate or to detect small dark moving spot. So there's lots of proposals for the natural function. And these are different contents, and it doesn't look like evolution is going to cut between them. Evolution is indifferent to these various alternatives. So that's one kind of indeterminacy. Another kind is Quinean indeterminacy. So suppose we settle on fly as being better than, or a better candidate for the natural function than, say, frog food or small dark moving spot. Then there's still the issue of whether evolution prefers fly over fly stage or undetached fly part. It seems as if those alternatives are indifferent from the point of view of evolution or natural selection. So why do these indeterminacy issues matter? They matter because all these candidates are different contents. They have different truth conditions. So if the proposal is actually explaining content rather than something else, maybe natural information or something, then it should specify a content with determinate truth conditions. Now, one reaction to these problems is just to give up content. So let me turn to this proposal. You can be an eliminatist about content, like Chomsky and Stitch of the 1983 book. The idea then is that cognitive neuroscience doesn't really ascribe contents to internal states or structures. So if you go back to my diagram of the adder, the proposal is to just lop off the top. There's only the realization function. There's only states and structures that are causally implicated in cognition, and they don't get any interpretation. Now the problem here is that without content, there seems to be no connection between the posited structures specified by the realization function, the bottom mapping, and the cognitive capacity to be explained, addition, vision, or whatever. So why think that a particular causal transition of internal states is adding? We may have a nice causal account of what's going on, but why is that adding? We can't see what the connection is between the the processing story and what the system's doing. So we could express that problem by saying that there's a kind of explanatory gap if we just go eliminativist on content. So in my view, one of the important roles of content is filling this explanatory gap between the processing story, the mechanical account, purely naturalistic, and our understanding of the interesting cognitive capacity that the subject has that we're trying to explain. So that's one key idea in my account. What I'm going to do is kind of sketch the proposal in really broad terms and then appeal to a couple of examples so you can kind of get the flavor of it. So the guiding idea of this view that I call content pragmatism is that content description is governed by pragmatic considerations. The assignment of content is fixed primarily by the cognitive capacity to be explained. A vision theorist must assign visual contents. So the theorist looks for distal properties that structure the light in appropriate ways. This is partly a pragmatic matter. Contents must bear on the relevant explanatory project. So I spell out this account of content in more detail in a paper that came out last year in Phil Studies. So that's the general idea. In general, contents are assigned to structures constructed in the course of processing. So you can think now of the fly, the frog and the fly. The frog's tongue is darting out, catch the fly. What's the content of the structure in its head? So in general, contents are assigned to structures constructed in the course of processing, primarily as a way of helping us keep track of the flow of information in the system, or more neutrally put, helping us keep track of changes in the system caused by both environmental events and internal processes. Or just think of normal human vision. With an eye on the cognitive capacity, that's the explanatory target of the theory. The choice of content will be responsive to such considerations as ease of explanation, and so may involve considerable idealization. So then, what I call the interpretation function in assigning content to the positive structures selects from all the information present in the signal only what's relevant for the cognitive capacity to be explained, and specifies it in a way that's salient for explanatory purposes. So if you think about the cat case, I pointed out what we all know, that there are lots of things in the causal chain leading from the distal property, tokening, a cat being there to the structure being tokened in my head, and one of those causal intermediaries are cat patterns on the retina. Well, the interpretation can just ignore that. it selects from all of the information that's in the causal chain just what's relevant for explaining the cognitive capacity. And it can specify it in a way that's salient. So it can specify it as a cat rather than an undetached cat parts or cat stages. But on this view, I mean, so there's pragmatic considerations coming in. The interpretation function is part of an explanatory gloss. It's driven by explanatory considerations, by pragmatic considerations, but it's part of a gloss. Okay, so let's turn to resolving indeterminacy on this account. So take the frog, fly, frog food, small, dark moving spot. The selection of content is going to be sensitive to the relevant explanatory project. So if the goal is to explain the role of the frog in the environment, in its environmental niche, its normal ecological niche, then that might privilege fly, because what you're interested in is predator-prey relations, and how the frog relates to other animals, and so on. On the other hand, if we're interested strictly in the frog's visual mechanisms, then that might privilege ascribing content small, dark, moving spot. So the choice of content is going to be sensitive to the explanatory project. This, I think, is why teleosemanticists end up plumping for different contents, because they've got different explanatory projects in mind. With respect to Quinean indeterminacy, the privileged interpretation is typically going to specify the contents in terms of the public language. So the public language is seemingly committed to objects rather than object stages and undetached object parts. So the public language, the interpretation then is going to favor straightforward cat, fly, frog contents rather than stages or undetached parts. Now, that's not naturalistic, that's pragmatic. A naturalistic semantics can't appeal to public meaning. That's not kosher. So the general point is that pragmatic considerations select among equally naturalistic alternatives. The explanatory focus is what resolves these various indeterminacies. And explanatory focus is a pragmatic consideration. So unlike the naturalistic proposal, so this isn't naturalistic, it's bringing in appeals to explanatory interests, it's bringing in pragmatic considerations. Unlike the naturalistic proposals, there's no presumption that a naturalistic relation alone determines content. Content isn't naturalized on this account, rather it's quarantined in the gloss. Okay. I can develop the idea more in Q&A if you're interested, but that's really all I want to say about the content issue at the moment. So turning to the issue of vehicles, what is it for an internal state to function as a representation? If we're going to posit representations, they've got to be doing some explanatory work. So it's not obvious what work is required of a representation. So that's what I want to focus on now. So the standard picture is the language of thought, endorsed by Jerry Fodors and Polishin, many other people. Mental representations are symbols in an internal language called mentalese. And then the realization function, the bottom mapping, specifies the syntax of the language of thought, and the S's in the middle of the diagram, those are going to be symbols that go together to form meaningful sentences. So the model here is public language. And I think that in general, our intuitions about mental representation tend to be shaped by our understanding of public representation. That's what we're all familiar with. But a couple of things need to be said. One is that while the information encoded in printed text, so sticking strictly to the printed word, explicit public representation, the information must be usable. It's not enough for it to be encoded. So in addition to inert data structures, there must be processes that read them. So for example, imagine an encyclopedia that's got no table of contents and no index. Everything might be in there, but it's not usable, then it's pointless. Or think about a library that's got no catalog. All the information is explicitly represented, but there are no processes that use that information. So for mental representation, the process can't be understanding. That's on pain of under-explaining intentionality or representation. The process can't rely on anything like an understanding process. So this is the idea behind Fodor's formality condition. Mental processes are sensitive only to what he calls formal properties of the vehicles. They're sensitive to various physical properties. The formal properties is a little bit misleading there. He means roughly physical properties. Oops. Okay, so one problem is that other sorts of cognitive models do not posit explicit representations. One problem for understanding straightforwardly how mental representations function is that lots of models don't fit the language of thought form. There's some dispute about whether they're really representational, because our intuitions about mental representation tend to be driven by focusing on the written word, on public language. These don't fit it. So connectionist models, dynamical models, embodied and enactive models. Really, what the existence of these models, these different kinds of models, compel us to reconsider our intuitions about what counts as a representation. It's not just explicitly represented language. The linguistic model's too restrictive. However, with respect to these other types of cognitive models, intuitions, at least among philosophers, tend to differ. So Clark, in a 1997 work, Bill Bechtel, and others argue for a representational construal of connectionist and dynamical models. Chimero, Gallagher, Bill in his book argue against a representational construal. Bill says that the connectionist structures are what he calls mere causal relays. If they count as representations, then Bill thinks that pan-representationalism follows, and lots of obviously non-representational things would count as representations. So there's lots of controversy about whether these non-language of thought models count as representational. So some of the controversy has focused on the Watt governor. This should be familiar to most of you. This was introduced into the discussion in the mid-90s by Tim Van Gelder. And the dispute is about whether the angle of the arms here, as the engine goes faster, the arms go up by centrifugal force. And the question is whether the angle of the arms represents the speed of the flywheel. So again, many people say yes. Many people just as strongly convinced that the answer is no. Another recent locus of dispute is Bill's the toy car that Bill describes in his book. So the idea here is that this toy car is able to negotiate a tricky S-curve because it's got a rudder and groove system that guides the wheels of the car over the curve. And Bill says that that's representational because the structure in the car is isomorphic to the curve in the road. And then others disagree. Not surprisingly, again, strong views on both sides. Francois Tonneau, in an interesting review, says if that's representational, then a key represents a lock. That just seems wrong, according to many. I'm not taking a stand on this, and I'll say why in a minute. In general, though, there are three sources of representational skepticism. Three general reasons why the skeptics, tend to resist a representational construal of these various examples. One is that they've got what we might think of as a too narrow language-based construal of representation, And so these cases are clearly not linguistic. There's no language of thought. So now I'm thinking back to connectionist, dynamical, embodied, and activist models. They don't fit that narrow, restrictive account, so some conclude they're not really genuinely representational. A second source of skepticism is the idea that representation isn't necessary for cognition. Rodney Brooks says that explicit representations just get in the way. I think this is really rhetoric. He's arguing against a certain kind of representation. But I don't really have time to get into that right now. A third reason is the inactivist objection, what they call the hard problem of content. So Pato and Mayan in their 2013 book cite what they call the covariance doesn't constitute content principle. The idea is that covariance neither suffices for nor otherwise constitutes content, where content minimally requires the existence of truth-bearing properties. So, let me just add that the covariation theorists like Early, Dretske, and Fodor recognized this, and that's why they add all these complicated bells and whistles to their account, and maybe it still doesn't, it still isn't sufficient for determining content. But according to an activist then, in light of this hard problem of content, there are three options. We can give up content and hence give up mental representation. We can hope that content can be naturalized in some other way, kind of the Panglossian alternative, or posit content as an irreducible explanatory primitive, a kind of dualism. That's obviously unsatisfactory. And activists propose one. So Hutto and Mayan say the best option is just to give up content, at least except for high-level linguistic content, and so give up mental representation. I'm proposing a fourth option. I'm proposing don't give up content, but recognize that it's in part motivated by explanatory considerations, and so confine it to a gloss. Okay, so turning back to the general problem of what is it for a mental representation to function as a representation, I don't think that we make any progress on that question by focusing on the non-cognitive examples, like the Watt governor, like the toy car. I don't think that tells us anything about how the concept of mental representation or appeal to mental representation functions in accounts of our cognitive capacities. To get a handle on that issue, we've got to look at the typical explanatory context in which an appeal to mental representation arises. And that context is a manifest cognitive capacity. You've got some organism that can add, that can see, that can locomote around its environment, that can manipulate objects. That's the explanatory context that we start with, a manifest cognitive capacity, and then representations get posited in the explanation of that capacity. That's, I think, the only way we're going to learn, arrive at some kind of answer to this question at the top. So the key idea here is that the realization function, the bottom mapping, isolates the causal structure relevant for the exercise of a given cognitive capacity. This will typically involve characterizing a set of states or structures and processes that operate on these structures. And then the second mapping, the top mapping, the interpretation function, will interpret at least some of these states and structures, that is, assign them a meaning, but that interpretation function is part of a gloss. So that's my answer to the question, what is it for an internal state to function as a representation in an account of a cognitive capacity? So given the meaning assignment specified by the interpretation function, the structures specified by the bottom mapping, the vehicles, are representational vehicles and not mere causal relays, as they would be without the semantic interpretation. They're interpreted structures. They've got meaning, if only in the gloss. They are causal relays, but not merely so. And these representational vehicles are as real as structures posited in any well-confirmed scientific explanation of observable phenomena. So given that, then a fictionalist interpretation of this account of representation isn't appropriate. So an analogy. This is an analogy for representational vehicles. Genes are realized by certain physical chemical structures. Molecular biology groups these structures together by their causal powers to produce certain phenotypical effects. Similarly, the realization function abstracts away from some of the properties of the realizing neural states and groups them together by their causal powers subserving a particular cognitive capacity. The realization function is a specification of the causal organization of the system at a relatively high level of abstraction. All that is to motivate the realism of the account of representational vehicles. So, back to the model, the problematic cognitive models. Connectionist, dynamical, and embodied models of cognition are representational just in case they identify vehicles by way of a realization function and assign them contents in an interpretation function. Okay, so I'm just about to wrap up. I'll conclude with the adequacy conditions. So mental representations must serve a function sufficiently like paradigm cases of representation. It's not clear exactly how this one should be satisfied, but I think that the account satisfies any reasonable construal of the constraint. It specifies clear conditions for representational vehicles and contents. True, mental representations have their contents only in an explanatory gloss, but public linguistic representations have their contents only by convention. So the fact that the content of mental representations is partly determined by pragmatic considerations shouldn't be disqualifying, shouldn't make it somehow not genuinely representational, or not sufficiently like paradigm cases. Secondly, their content should be causally relevant to their role in cognitive processes. Now, lots of people have made this point. So the way that Dretske puts it is that content there should be an account of how content gets its hands on the wheel. So he wants content to actually be driving the system. That can't really be right because content is abstract. So it can't be a cause. So the way to really interpret this constraint is that content ascription should causally explain the operation of the system. It's got to play a role in causally explaining, not actually causing. That's the plausible interpretation. But I think that actually putting it that way, thinking that the content, so the idea then is that it's in virtue of having the content that it does, that a particular mental state is able to play the role that it does in cognitive processing. That's the idea. But I think that actually gets things backwards. I think that what content does is it captures a salient part of the causal nexus in which the state is embedded. So, in other words, if the frog structure has the content, is attributed the content fly, then that makes perspicuous, that highlights kind of the production end of the causal chain. Again, as I said, it highlights the causes of the tokening of the mental structure in the frog's typical or normal ecological niche. On the other hand, if the internal structure is attributed the content frog food, say, not Cirelli's proposal, then that highlights the consumption end. That highlights the effects of the tokening of this structure in the fly's physiological system. So different explanatory interests, different explanatory focus, different content attributions, but what the content attribution is doing is, given a particular explanatory focus, it makes manifest, it makes salient the relevant part of the causal story. That's, I think, one of the important roles of content. So thus, it's no surprise that content looks to be causally relevant. One of its jobs is to characterize internal structures or states in a way that makes perspicuous their causal role in a cognitive process, again, given very specific explanatory interests or projects. Okay, thirdly, the account should not imply pan-representationalism. It shouldn't make everything turn out to be a representation. This isn't a worry, because I'm not offering a metaphysical theory of representation. I'm not specifying a general relation that holds independently of explanatory practice in cognitive neuroscience. It doesn't have any implications for Venus flytraps or Watt governors and so on. Hence, the account is deflationary. Lastly, the account should neither under-explain our representational capacities, presupposing understanding, presupposing part of what we're trying to explain, nor, on the other hand, should it over-explain them, positing mere causal relays. With respect to the first thing, under-explaining, it's obviously not a problem. The bottom mapping, the realization function, which specifies cognitive processes, doesn't posit any intentional processes, so there's no unexplained understanding. It complies with, it's purely mechanical, it complies with Fodor's formality constraint. It's the second clause here, I think, that's more interesting, the over-explaining requirement. And here I want to challenge it. With respect to over-explaining, cognitive neuroscience offers reductive accounts of cognitive capacity. So remember back to Fodor and Field's motivation for pursuing a naturalistic semantics project. It's to try to reductively explain intentionality. The guiding intuition being that it's got to disappear somewhere in the picture down to the ultimate elements. It's not fundamental. And I think that any reductive account of a phenomenon is likely to look like over-explaining, especially a mental phenomenon. I mean, think about consciousness. If we actually had a naturalistic account of consciousness, then it's probably going to look like we've explained it away. There's going to be all the, but what about the what it's like of phenomenal experience? Where's that? So what's going to arise here in any reductive account of a mental phenomena is an explanatory gap, the famous explanatory gap in phenomenal experience, but there's one here as well, the one that was left unbridged by the content delimitivus. So the gloss given by the interpretation function has the job of connecting the reductive account to the intentionally characterized phenomenon. That's the explanatory target. It's got the job of bridging that explanatory gap, bridging back from the mechanical account to our pre-theoretic, common sense way of understanding ourselves as rational agents. If our representational capacities are really to be explained, that is naturalistically explained, then at some point the notions of representation and content are going to drop out of the picture. And what's left may look like mere causal relays. Thanks.